Charles Wood stood frozen in front of Lucas Silverman's mahogany desk, his weathered hands tightening around the brim of his old hat. The office was cold, sterile, every surface gleaming with wealth that mocked him in his helplessness. His eyes carried regret, years of failure etched into their tired lines. "Mr. Silverman," Charles said, his voice trembling yet laced with desperation, "surely we can come up with another option. Please, there must be another way." Lucas. Silverman leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the armrest with an air of impatience. His dark eyes glinted with amusement more than sympathy. "No," he said, almost huffing the word as though Charles's plea was an annoyance. "The deal was clear. You had 5 years. 5 years, Mr. Wood, to repay every cent. You failed. And now, as agreed, your daughter will belong to me for 3 years. Charles flinched at the words, his chest tightening as if a blade had pierced his heart. "But my daughter doesn't know about this deal," he whispered, guilt choking his throat. He remembered her laughter, her trust, the way she still believed her father could protect her from the world. Silverman's lips curled into a smirk. "That's not my concern. Whether she knows or not makes no difference. What matters is you signed the agreement." He leaned forward, his tone sharp, cutting away any room for hope. "You have until the end of the week. Pay me what you owe, or bring your daughter to my door." Charles's knees weakened under the weight of the ultimatum. The thought of betraying his daughter's innocence, of delivering her into the hands of a man like Silverman, tore him apart. Yet the crushing reality was undeniable. He had no money, no assets, no time. He had gambled on his dreams and lost. And now his failure would cost his daughter everything. "Now leave my office," Silverman said coldly, dismissing him with a flick of his hand. "We have nothing else to discuss. Either pay or bring me the girl." Charles turned toward the door, his heart pounding in anguish. His fingers trembled as they touched the brass handle, and he fought the tears threatening to fall. For years he had worked himself to the bone to shield her from pain, but his past mistakes had found their way back, demanding a price far greater than he could bear. As he stepped into the hallway, the weight of his choices pressed down heavier than ever. He had only days to find a miracle, or sacrifice his daughter's future to save his own soul from ruin. Charles Wood trudged out of Lucas Silverman's office with the weight of despair clinging to his shoulders like a heavy cloak. The polished hallways of Silverman's firm blurred before his eyes, shame and regret burning his chest. Every step echoed with the haunting truth. He had failed. Not just himself, not just the company he had promised to build, but his daughter, Nora. Nora Wood was not just a daughter, she was his life's brightest light. At 23, she was brilliant, breathtakingly beautiful, and filled with an energy that demanded to be seen. 2 MBAs, fluent in 3 languages, and a natural leader, she carried herself with the grace of her late mother and the fiery determination of her father's best days. To the world, she was a rising star. But to Charles, she was still the little girl he had cradled through nights of tears after her mother's passing. The little girl who once stood at the window waiting for him to come home from the factory. Smiling through grief, she was too young to understand. He had tried to shield her, to keep her in a world free of the ugliness he had endured. He told himself he was protecting her, but deep down, shame was the true chain that bound him. Every time Nora had come to him, bright-eyed and eager to help, saying, "Father, let me work with you. I can make a difference, I promise," he had brushed her off. He couldn't bear for her to see how much he had failed, how the debts piled up, how the company's foundation cracked under his poor decisions. What he hadn't known, what Lucas Silverman had ensured he never realized, was that the game had been rigged from the start. Lucas's loans, his promises of partnerships and resources, all came with hidden snares, contracts laced with traps that would tighten around Charles's throat no matter how hard he worked. Charles believed he had been buying time to rebuild, but in truth, Lucas was pulling the strings, setting him up for failure, waiting for this very moment. And now the price wasn't just Charles's pride, it was Nora. As Charles drove home, his mind raced with torment. He replayed every decision, every refusal to let Nora stand beside him. He had believed involving her would taint her brilliance, drag her down into his mire of failure. But now he saw with piercing clarity that she had always been the key. Nora's intellect, her education, her fire. If he had trusted her, the company might have stood tall, the debts might have been conquered, and Lucas Silverman might never have had this hold over them. At the house, he found Tatiana in the kitchen, her sharp eyes narrowing as soon as she saw his expression. She had been a second mother to Nora since the funeral, carrying her sister's legacy with devotion. "What did he say?" she demanded, folding her arms. Charles sank into a chair, his voice hollow. "He wants Nora. He'll take her if I don't. Pay by week's end." Tatiana's face drained of color, then flushed with fury. "Over my dead body. Do you think Amelia," she rarely spoke her sister's name, "would ever forgive you if you handed her daughter over to that snake?" Charles buried his face in his hands. "I never meant for this to happen. I thought I was buying us time. I thought I could fix it. But I see now. I've been blind. Nora was the answer all along, and I pushed her away." From the staircase, above, a soft voice broke through their storm. "Father?" Charles looked up sharply. Nora stood there, her long dark hair tumbling over her shoulders, her eyes wide with concern. She had heard enough to know something was wrong. In that moment, Charles's heart split in two. He wanted to keep shielding her, to keep her from the darkness that loomed at their door. But another part of him, the part that had finally admitted his mistakes, whispered the truth. The only way to protect her now was to let her in. He rose slowly, his voice shaking but resolute. "Nora, I've kept too much from you, but if I'm going to save you, if we're going to save this family, I need you. I should have trusted you long ago." Nora descended the stairs, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "Then trust me now, Father," she said firmly. "Let me help you fight him." Charles realized then that the battle ahead would not just be his, it would be theirs. Nora Wood had spent the last 2 nights buried in files, whispers of rumors, and every scrap of information she could dig up on Lucas Silverman. She read the testimonies of former business partners who had mysteriously gone bankrupt, the trail of ruined companies that had once thrived before falling into his orbit. He was ruthless, calculating, and dangerously charming when it suited him. But most of all, he was a man who preyed on weaknesses, who smelled desperation like blood in the water. So when she stepped into his office, she had already rehearsed her part. She wouldn't come as the accomplished woman who had conquered academia and mastered languages. No, she would come as the sheltered daughter, blinded by her devotion to her father. Lucas had to believe she was nothing more than a desperate girl pleading for mercy. The office door clicked shut behind her, and Lucas glanced up from his papers. His dark smile spread slowly across his face, as though he had been expecting her. "Well, well, Miss Wood, I wondered how long it would take for you to appear." Nora clasped her hands tightly in front of her, her expression soft, almost trembling. She let her voice carry the edge of a plea. "Please, Mr. Silverman, don't punish my father for his mistakes. He's only ever tried his best." Her eyes glistened and she lowered her gaze, every movement calculated. "If you need someone to blame, let it be me, but don't take everything from him." Lucas rose from his chair, circling her like a predator assessing prey. "You love him that much?" he asked, his tone curious, but there was a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Yes," Nora whispered, her breath unsteady. "He's all I have left since my mother passed. I'll do whatever it takes to protect him." She let her voice break slightly on the word whatever, allowing Lucas to hear what he wanted, a daughter willing to sacrifice herself for her father. But inside, Nora's mind was sharp, cataloguing every flicker of expression on his face, every word he emphasized. She knew Lucas had been watching her for years, long before her father even realized he was trapped. It wasn't just about money. Lucas wanted her, her beauty, her intelligence, perhaps even her spirit, because he thought she could be controlled. "So," Lucas finally said, stopping in front of her, tilting her chin upward with one finger. His smile was smooth, dangerous. "I expect loyalty, obedience, a daughter who puts me above her father. Can you give me that, Miss Wood?" Nora forced herself to look up at him with wide, tear-brimmed eyes, masking the steel behind them. "If it means saving my father, yes." Inside, she burned with resolve. She wasn't surrendering. She was gathering intelligence. Now she knew exactly what kind of man she would be facing. Nora returned home late that evening, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor as she stepped into the house. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with tension and worry. Her father sat slumped in the worn armchair by the fireplace, his hands rubbing at his temples. Tatiana stood nearby, arms folded, her sharp eyes fixed on Nora the second she walked in. "Nora," Charles said quickly, straightening, his voice raw with guilt. "Where have you been? I was worried sick." "I went to see him," Nora interrupted gently, her tone calm but steady. "I went to Lucas Silverman." Charles's face drained of color. He surged to his feet, his voice breaking. "No, Nora, why would you? I told you, I never wanted you near him." Tatiana's expression tightened, though she didn't interrupt. She watched Nora carefully, as if weighing her niece's every breath. "I had to," Nora said firmly. She stepped further into the room, the flicker of the fire catching the determination in her eyes. "If we're going to fight him, I needed to know what kind of man he is, and what he expects." Charles shook his head, horror in his gaze. "You don't know what he's capable of, Nora. I know exactly what he's capable of." Nora cut in, her voice rising. "I did my homework. I've read about the businesses he destroyed, the families he's left broken. I know he's ruthless. And now I've seen him with my own eyes." She drew a breath, steadying herself. "He wants me, not just to take me away from you, but to own me. Obedience, loyalty, everything. He wants to strip me from you piece by piece." Tatiana exhaled sharply, her jaw tightening. "That's why he made the deal," she murmured, almost to herself. "He's been circling you, Nora, watching you. You were the prize all along." Charles groaned, his face collapsing into his hands. "God forgive me. I thought I was protecting you. I thought keeping you out of the business was saving you from this darkness, but I only walked you straight into it." His voice cracked. "I've failed you, Nora." Nora crossed the room and knelt before him, placing her hands over his. Her tone softened, but her resolve did not waver. "No, Father, you haven't failed me. You gave me everything you could. But now it's my turn to fight for us, for our family, for the company Mother loved too." Tatiana stepped forward, her eyes fierce. "She's right, Charles. Lucas underestimates her. He sees a fragile daughter blinded by love for her father. Let him keep seeing that. Meanwhile, we'll use his arrogance against him." Nora nodded, her gaze steady. "We don't have much time. By the end of this week, he expects me. But I won't walk into this blindly. We'll play his game, on the surface. Behind it, we'll set our own pieces in place." Charles stared at her, torn between fear and pride. For the first time in years, he saw not just his little girl, but the woman she had become. "Nora," he whispered, his eyes brimming. "What do you plan to do?" Nora straightened, her face lit by the fire's glow. "Every inch her mother's daughter. Find his weakness, and when I do, I'll make sure Lucas Silverman regrets ever setting his sights on us." That night, long after Charles had gone to bed, Nora sat at her desk with papers spread around her, her laptop glowing in the dim light. Her heart pounded, but her mind was razor-sharp. Lucas thought she was naive, an emotional daughter willing to sacrifice everything for her father. But she wasn't going to play his game blindly. She began with the trail of companies Lucas had gutted. One by one, she mapped out their fall. Businesses that had thrived until his loans and partnerships drained them dry. She noticed a pattern in the contracts, clauses designed to suffocate anyone who signed. And yet, buried among the wreckage, there were whispers of resistance. One or two companies that had fought back, even if they hadn't survived. Nora scribbled their names on a notepad, determined to track down any surviving partners or employees who could tell her what Lucas feared. "Knowledge is leverage," she whispered to herself, echoing something her mother used to say. If she could uncover the weakness Lucas hid beneath his empire, she could turn the tables. Tatiana slipped quietly into the room, watching her niece. "You're your mother's daughter," she said softly, pride and sorrow mixing in her voice. "Amelia would have done the same. Just remember, Nora, when you play against men like Lucas, one wrong move can cost you everything." "I know," Nora replied without looking up, "but if I don't try, he'll take everything anyway." The next evening, Lucas Silverman sent for her. The invitation arrived in the form of a sleek black car idling outside their home. A silent demand she couldn't refuse. Charles protested, but Nora squeezed his hand, whispering, "Trust me, I'll be back." The dinner was held in an exclusive restaurant, dimly lit, private enough that the hum of other guests was little more than background noise. Lucas rose when she entered, his smile smooth and dangerous. "Miss Wood," he said, offering his hand. "I'm glad you accepted my invitation." Nora played her part perfectly. She allowed her nervousness to show, even fidgeting with the edge of her napkin as they sat. I want to understand what you expect of me," she said. Softly, her voice laced with vulnerability. Lucas leaned back, studying her like a cat toying with a bird. "What I expect," he said slowly, "is loyalty. Honesty, proof that you are not just saying you'll sacrifice for your father, but showing me." He poured her a glass of wine, his eyes never leaving hers. "So tonight, prove it. Tell me a secret your father would never want me to know." Nora froze, her chest tightening. She could feel his trap tightening around her. This was his test, his way of measuring how far she would go. She lowered her gaze, letting her lashes shield the fire in her eyes. "Careful," she told herself. "Give him something that feels real, but not enough to hurt father." Her lips trembled as she leaned closer and whispered, "He still cries for my mother at night. He thinks no one hears him, but I do." Lucas's smile widened. He believed her, and Nora, behind her mask of trembling devotion, knew she had just passed his first test and bought herself more time to dig deeper into his empire. The following evening, Lucas's black car came for her again, this time carrying a garment bag and a note written in his sharp, arrogant hand. "Wear this tonight. I want the world to see who walks at my side." Inside the bag was a gown of deep crimson silk, elegant, daring, and cut in a way that made Nora's cheeks flush with heat. It wasn't her style, nor was it meant to be. It was Lucas's choice, designed to humiliate her by making her feel like an ornament on his arm, rather than a woman of her own standing. Still, Nora slipped into the gown and painted her face with careful restraint. Tonight, she would play the role he demanded, the loyal, beautiful companion. If Lucas wanted to show her off like a possession, then she would let him, while silently memorizing the faces in the room, the deals whispered in corners, the alliances he flaunted. The dinner party was private but decadent, filled with men and women of wealth and power. The clink of crystal glasses and low hum of conversation filled the air. Lucas kept her close, his hand possessive at the small of her back, introducing her with a smirk as "my newest treasure." Nora smiled sweetly, her eyes lowered just enough to sell the illusion of obedience. But as Lucas basked in his own pride, Nora's attention caught on a young man across the room. He wasn't much older than her, perhaps late 20s, with sharp features and a watchful gaze. Unlike the others, he didn't leer or dismiss her as a pretty accessory. His eyes, calm and discerning, studied Lucas, not with admiration, but with quiet contempt. When Lucas became absorbed in a story, boasting about his latest acquisition, the young man drifted closer. He didn't speak, didn't draw attention to himself. As he passed by Nora, his hand brushed against hers for the briefest moment, leaving behind a small card tucked into her palm. She glanced down quickly, just enough to see his name, Chris Atwater. When she looked up, Chris was already walking away, blending into the crowd with deliberate ease. But before he disappeared, he gave her one quick glance, steady, meaningful, as though to say, "You're not alone." Nora's heart quickened, but she schooled her features, slipping the card discreetly into the folds of her gown. Lucas, oblivious, went on bragging, his voice carrying over the laughter of the room. Nora tilted her head, offering him a smile that appeared soft and devoted, but her mind was far from the table. For the first time since stepping into Lucas Silverman's snare, she had a thread of hope. Someone else was watching, someone who knew what she was to Lucas, and perhaps had the power to help her fight back. Nora had tried in the early days to reach Chris Atwater. That card he had slipped into her hand had felt like a lifeline, but when she sent a message to the discreet number scrawled on the back, there was no reply. Days turned into weeks, and her hope soured into anger. Perhaps it had been a cruel trick, a taunt meant to remind her of how powerless she was under Lucas Silverman's grip. Still, she couldn't ignore him. Chris appeared again and again at the dinners, the charity galas, the private meetings where Lucas paraded her. Like a prize, always standing at a distance, always silent, his eyes followed, steady and assessing, though never lingering too long. Nora began to feel the tension coil inside her chest whenever she spotted him. She despised him for offering that thread of hope, only to leave her stranded. And yet, she couldn't shake the thought that he was watching for a reason. Lucas noticed, of course. He noticed everything. One night, after catching the sharp glare Nora shot across the room at Chris, he leaned close and let out a deep, amused laugh. "I'm glad," he said loudly enough for others at the table to hear, "that there's finally someone you hate more than me." He clapped her back as if it were all a joke, his laughter booming. Nora forced a smile. Through clenched teeth, hating both men in that moment, one for chaining her, the other for haunting her without explanation. 3 months into the arrangement, the unexpected happened. Chris walked straight into Lucas Silverman's office. Nora, foiling contracts at Lucas's demand, froze when she heard his voice. Calm, direct, confident. "I want to buy part of your contracts over her," Chris said, his gaze steady on Lucas. Lucas's brows shot up, his smirk widening. "And what makes you think I'd be willing to do that? She's quite the investment, after all." Chris's tone didn't waver. "Because you're a businessman, I only need her for 6 months, and then you can have her back. You still win." Nora's heart pounded. She wanted to shout at Chris, to demand what game he was playing, but she held her tongue. Lucas leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the desk, his dark eyes glittering. 6 months, you say? And what exactly would you do with her during that time?" Chris didn't hesitate. "I need someone fluent in French until I close this deal in Paris. She'll be my companion at negotiations, my interpreter when needed. Arm candy until the ink dries." Lucas chuckled low, his gaze sliding toward Nora. "The fire in her eyes when she looks at me is exciting. That fury, priceless." He turned back to Chris, lips curling into a wolfish smile. "But very well. You can borrow her on one condition." Chris tilted his head. "And that is?" Lucas leaned forward, his voice sharp. "She is mine when you're not doing business. She needs to remember who holds the leash. Make no mistake, she's only being lent out, borrowed, as needed." Nora felt heat rush through her chest, part rage, part humiliation. She clenched, her fists tightly to keep from screaming, her mind already racing. For the first time since this nightmare began, she had been shifted into someone else's game piece. She didn't know what Chris truly wanted, but she knew one thing. If he thought he could simply borrow her, he would find she was far more than Lucas's prize. The moment Chris left Lucas's office, Nora's chest burned with fury. She waited only until the door shut before she turned on Lucas, her voice sharp and unflinching. "You will refuse his offer," she demanded. "I am not a piece of property to be passed around between you two. You don't own me, and you never will. My father's mistakes don't give you the right to treat me like something you can buy and sell." Lucas's smug grin faltered for a fraction of a second before his face darkened. He slammed his hand against the polished table so hard the sound echoed through the room. Nora flinched, but refused to step back. "You will do exactly as I say," Lucas hissed, his voice venomous. "You think you have power here. You think your defiance means something. I own your future, Nora. One word from me, and your father's company will be ruined beyond saving. I will drag his name through the mud until he's a laughingstock in every paper, in every circle. And your sweet Aunt Tatiana, I can make her life unbearable too. I don't need chains to control you. I can break everyone you love with a snap of my fingers." The silence that followed was heavy, the weight of his threat pressing down like a vice. But Nora, standing tall, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She steadied her breathing, lifted her chin, and locked eyes with him. "You may think you own me," she said, her voice low and unwavering, "but you will never break me." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked out of the office, her back straight, despite the storm of pain twisting inside her. She wouldn't let him see her crumble, not here. By the time she reached home, the facade cracked. Charles and Tatiana were waiting in the sitting room, both rising the moment she entered. The look on their faces, the worry, the unspoken question, made her chest tighten. "What happened?" Charles asked, his voice strained. Nora's lips trembled, but her eyes burned with fire. "Lucas tried to sell me off like I was property. Chris Atwater came to make an offer, and Lucas, he agreed to consider it. He threatened you both if I refused." Charles groaned, collapsing into his chair, anguish etched into his features. Tatiana, however, moved swiftly to Nora's side, gripping her shoulders firmly. "Listen to me," Tatiana said, her eyes fierce. "He wants you to feel powerless. Don't give him that victory. We'll find a way. Together." Nora nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had walked into Lucas's game, but she wouldn't let him write the ending. Not for her, and not for her family. Nora could hardly sleep that night, her mind caught between rage and despair. By morning she had made up her mind. If Chris Atwater thought he could casually bargain over her life, then he was no better than Lucas. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to wait for them to come to her. When she tracked him down at one of the networking luncheons Lucas insisted she attend, she didn't wait for pleasantries. The moment she caught him alone near the terrace, she cornered him, her voice low but laced with venom. "Why did you do it?" she demanded. "Why would you stand in that office and talk about me like I'm a commodity? You're no different than him, are you? Another man who thinks I'm just a bargaining chip." Chris's jaw tightened, but his eyes remained unreadable. He didn't deny her accusation, nor did he offer her comfort. "Not here," he said curtly. "This isn't the place." Nora scoffed, stepping closer. "You had the chance to prove you were better than him, but instead you spoke the same language, contracts and ownership. You think hiding behind business terms makes you different? It doesn't." For a moment, his composure cracked, something flickering in his gaze. Anger, frustration, maybe even guilt. But then it hardened again. "You don't understand," he said finally, his voice clipped, "and I'm not going to explain myself to you." Nora felt her stomach twist. His refusal only deepened her suspicion. To her, silence meant complicity. She glared at him, her hands curling into fists. "Then you're exactly like him," she spat, her voice trembling. "Cruel, calculating, maybe worse, because you want me to believe you're different." Chris didn't flinch. He simply gave her a long, unreadable look before walking away, leaving her shaking with fury. When she returned home that evening, Tatiana was waiting with a look that brooked no delay. "Nora, sit," her aunt ordered. "Your father has something. He needs to tell you." Charles sat hunched in his chair, his hands trembling as he rubbed at his face. "I should have told you sooner," he whispered. "I thought I was protecting you, but I see now my silence only put you in deeper danger." Nora sat across from him, her anger from earlier still simmering, but she forced herself to listen. Charles exhaled shakily. "Lucas never intended for me to succeed. Every loan, every contract, there were traps. He tied me in so tightly that even when I paid, I owed more. He pushed me into corners until there was no way out, and then he made me sign the agreement. The one that bound you to him if I failed." His voice broke. "I thought I'd have time, that I could find a way to pay before he ever looked at you. But he's been watching you from the start. You were never just leverage. You were the goal." The room fell into silence. Tatiana's hand tightened over Nora's, her eyes filled with grief and fire. Nora blinked back the sting of tears, her resolve hardening. "Then we know the truth. Lucas set this trap for all of us. And Chris may be part of his game, or maybe not. But either way, I'll find out." Her voice was quiet, but steel, threaded through every word. "And when I do, Lucas will regret ever thinking he could own me." The next test came sooner than Nora expected. Lucas invited her to a charity gala at one of the city's most prestigious hotels. She knew by now that invited meant summoned. Still, she dressed with quiet dignity, choosing a sleek black gown rather than the brighter, more revealing dress Lucas had sent for her. She wanted at least some measure of control, however small. But Lucas noticed the instant she stepped out of the car. His smile was wide, but his eyes burned with irritation. "Defiant, are we?" he murmured, leaning close enough that his words were for her alone. "Let's make sure everyone knows who you belong to." Inside the grand ballroom, glittering chandeliers bathed the crowd in light. Politicians, bankers, CEOs, all mingled, and raised glasses of champagne. Nora walked beside Lucas, her chin lifted despite the pounding of her heart. She thought she could keep her composure, play the role as she had before, until Lucas deliberately raised his voice. "Gentlemen, ladies," he called, drawing the attention of a small group clustered around the bar. His arm slid possessively around Nora's waist. "May I introduce Nora Wood? Beautiful, isn't she? A rare little gem I've recently acquired." Nora's face went hot, but she kept her smile in place. Around them, people chuckled uncomfortably, some smirked knowingly. She forced herself to stand still, even as humiliation burned through her chest. Lucas wasn't finished. He leaned closer, pretending to whisper in her ear, but speaking loud enough for those nearby to hear. "She's obedient too, though sometimes she needs reminding." He let out a booming laugh, squeezing her hip until her skin bruised beneath his grip. The crowd laughed along uneasily, no one daring to challenge him. Nora's hands trembled, but she dug her nails into her palm until the pain steadied her. She refused to give him the tears he wanted, and then she saw him. Across the room, standing near the edge of the dance floor, Chris Atwater watched. His expression was hard, his jaw tight, his fists clenched at his sides. Their eyes locked, and for a split second, Nora felt seen, not as Lucas's possession, but as a human being suffocating under chains. Lucas followed her gaze and noticed Chris. A slow, mocking grin spread across his face. He pulled Nora even closer and whispered, "Ah, there's your little admirer. He can watch all he likes, but you and I both know you're mine." Then, louder for everyone nearby, Smile, darling. Let them see how much you adore me. Nora tilted her head toward him, her lips curving into the sweetest smile she could summon, though her eyes burned with hate. The fire Lucas enjoyed so much flickered behind her gaze, but this time it wasn't only for him. Chris Atwater had seen enough. Nora didn't know what he would do or when, but she knew Lucas had just made a dangerous mistake. Humiliation in private was one thing, public cruelty was another, and Chris looked ready to stop watching from the sidelines. A few days later, Nora was summoned to Lucas Silverman's office. The cold gleam in his eyes made her stomach twist. Before he even spoke, "You have a scheduled appointment with Mr. Atwater tomorrow evening," Lucas said flatly, sliding a slim folder across the desk. "Downtown restaurant, 7 o'clock sharp. You will sit beside him, take notes, and return to me with every detail. I want to know exactly what his business deals are about." He leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "And if you fail me, Nora—" He paused, letting the weight of his threat hang in the air. "I'll make you pay in ways you can't imagine. Do you understand?" Nora kept her expression calm, though inside her pulse raced. She nodded. "Yes, Mr. Silverman." The next evening, the restaurant buzzed with soft music and the quiet murmur of wealthy patrons. Chris was already seated when she arrived, crisp in a tailored suit, his demeanor all business. He stood briefly as she approached, pulling out her chair in a gesture of courtesy, but his face remained composed, unreadable. "We'll be meeting Mr. Laurent from Paris," he explained quickly. "Stay quiet unless spoken to. Take notes. Translate if needed, nothing more." His voice was clipped professional, leaving no space for personal exchanges. The dinner began. The client was warm and animated, speaking in a rapid blend of French and English. Chris handled the conversation with effortless precision, his charm polished, his arguments sharp. Nora only engaged when asked to translate a phrase or clarify a point, her fluency in French earning a few approving nods from the client. To her surprise, Chris introduced her politely, "Miss Wood, my associate for this evening," and never once treated her as an ornament or toy. When the deal was sealed with a handshake, Laurent departing in high spirits, Nora felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. She had expected Chris to pry into her, to taunt her as Lucas did, but instead he was professional to the core. As they left the restaurant, he simply handed her a copy of the contract notes. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That will be all for tonight." No lingering conversation, no attempt to provoke her, just polite dismissal. The following morning, Nora entered Lucas's office with a small recorder tucked in her palm. She placed it on his desk, her face impassive. Lucas pressed play, listening intently as the voices from the dinner filled the room. Chris negotiating, Nora translating, every word captured. A pleased smile crept over his face. "Well done," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Very well done. Perhaps you're learning your place after all." Nora inclined her head, slightly, concealing the quiet storm brewing inside her. Lucas was pleased, but she had seen something he hadn't. Chris Atwater, in the presence of power, had shown himself to be a gentleman, and that left her with more questions than ever. Lucas's demands grew bolder with each passing week. What began as simple note-taking at Chris's meetings soon evolved into dangerous assignments. Nora was sent into boardrooms filled with ruthless men, instructed to memorize numbers, contracts, and names, then deliver them all back to Lucas. She was pushed into roles where one misstep could expose her, and Lucas made it clear that failure would not only cost her, it would ruin her father and Tatiana too. But what Lucas didn't know was that Nora was quietly spinning her own web. Behind her composed smile and obedient nods, she carried the weapons of knowledge. A small listening device clipped into the lining of her handbag, a hidden camera tucked discreetly into her blouse. While she filed documents late into the night at Lucas's office, she slipped through folders, taking photos, copying data, cataloging every deal Lucas had manipulated. With every keystroke, she planted a crypt file deep inside his network, a program that would quietly gather information, cataloging transactions, contracts, and hidden offshore accounts. It was dangerous work, but Nora wasn't unprepared. Few knew that Tatiana's former boyfriend years earlier had been one of the top cybersecurity analysts in the country. Before his career took him overseas to a private intelligence firm, he had spent hours with Tatiana and Nora, teaching them the basics of hacking and digital defense. Nora had absorbed every lesson, every trick he'd taught her, things she never thought she'd need until now. They had kept in touch, and when she reached out under a discreet alias, he guided her from afar, helping her mask her digital footprints and strengthen her trap against Lucas. The deeper she went, the more dangerous it became. She could feel Lucas circling, his suspicion never far away, yet he seemed convinced that she was simply growing into the loyal companion he had crafted, his arrogance blinding him to the truth. Chris Atwater, however, was another matter. Working beside him in negotiations was disorienting. He was distant, cold even, but not cruel. Unlike Lucas, he never touched her without reason, never humiliated her in public, never looked at her like she was something to be owned. He gave her tasks, instructions, and space, no more, no less, and yet it left her with a storm of conflicting emotions. She didn't trust him. How could she, after seeing him speak of her like a piece of property before Lucas? But she couldn't hate him either. There was no malice in his eyes, only calculation. He was not her ally, not her enemy, but something else, something she hadn't figured out yet. At night, lying awake, she replayed the dinners, the business meetings, the sharp exchanges between them. He treated her as if she were capable, but kept his walls so high she could never glimpse what was behind them. Did he mean to protect her by staying distant? Or was he simply another man playing his own game, waiting for the moment it served him to reveal his hand? Nora clenched her fists under the covers, whispering into the dark, "I'll find out, Chris. I'll find out exactly who you are." And in the glow of her laptop screen, the crypt file ticked away silently, growing heavier with every secret it pulled from Lucas's empire. Lucas Silverman was clever, but his arrogance often drove him into carelessness. Nora saw it in the way he boasted about his power, in the way he spoke of Chris Atwater like an obstacle to be eliminated. She realized quickly that Lucas was plotting not only to keep her under his control, but to ruin Chris's business entirely. Lucas whispered about discrediting him in front of foreign investors, manipulating contracts, even planting scandals that would erode Chris's reputation. Nora felt the noose tightening, and she was caught in the middle. She didn't know if she could trust Chris with what she knew. Part of her still wondered if he might turn on her. But another part, the part that remembered his quiet professionalism and the absence of cruelty, began to whisper otherwise. The breaking point came during a private dinner. Chris was entertaining a small circle of potential investors with Nora, once again at his side. For most of the night she was silent, noting details, her hidden recorder capturing everything. Then it happened. One of the gentlemen leaned toward her, his voice slurred with arrogance and wine. "You're wasted here, darling," he murmured with a greedy smile. "Why don't you spend your time with me instead? I'll pay handsomely." The words made Nora's skin crawl, but before she could reply, Chris was on his feet. His voice cut through the table like a blade. "Apologize, now!" The man laughed nervously. It was only a joke. Chris's expression hardened into something dangerous, his tone deadly calm. "I said, apologize to her, or I will make sure you regret opening your mouth." The man paled, stumbling over his words. "My apologies, Miss Wood. I didn't mean any offense." Nora stared at Chris, her shock hidden behind a careful mask. She hadn't expected him to defend her so fiercely, not in public, not in front of powerful men who could jeopardize his deals. Yet there he stood, protective, unyielding. That night her thoughts were restless, and the next morning she made a decision. Using a burner phone, she sent a text to Chris. "Your business meetings with me are being recorded," and sent back to Lucas. Her thumb hovered before pressing send. A part of her braced for silence or for anger. The reply came minutes later. "And I'm counting on it. Keep it up." Nora's breath caught. She read the message again and again. He knew. Chris already knew Lucas was using her as a spy, and instead of avoiding it, he was turning it to his advantage. For the first time since this nightmare began, Nora understood where Chris stood. He wasn't Lucas's ally. He was playing his own long game against him. The next time they met, nothing outward had changed. He gave instructions, she obeyed, and their interactions remained professional and distant. But beneath the surface there was a new understanding. Two players in the same dangerous game, both moving quietly against the same enemy. Lucas Silverman had always prided himself on control of his deals, of his enemies, of Nora, but lately he could feel it slipping. It gnawed at him every time he remembered that dinner. Chris Atwater, standing up for Nora, threatening another man on her behalf. The way Chris's eyes had burned with anger, the way Nora had looked at him, startled, maybe even grateful. Lucas's jaw tightened just thinking about it. In his mind, it wasn't about business anymore. Chris wanted her, and worse, Nora knew it. So when Nora entered his office that afternoon, poised and calm as always, Lucas's temper flared. He barked the accusation without preamble. "You two seem awfully comfortable around each other." Nora froze, her pen hovering above her notebook. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone level. "You heard me," Lucas growled, rising half out of his chair. "That man, Atwater, he's not fooling me. He's too nice with you. He doesn't look at you the way he looks at others. Not the man I saw in this office weeks ago. And you—" His voice rose, sharp with accusation. "You don't glare at him anymore. You don't look at him with the same hate you do me." Nora's chest tightened, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "That's because," she said slowly, deliberately, "he treats me like a human being, not a commodity." The words sliced through the air like glass. Lucas's eyes darkened. His chair screeched back as he shot to his feet, fury radiating off him. "Don't lie to me, Nora!" But Nora didn't flinch. For too long she had played the obedient role, but something inside her snapped. She raised her voice, meeting his. "Anger head on. I'm not lying," she shouted, her voice trembling not with fear but with rage. "I'm not dumb, Lucas. I know you have someone watching me at all times. I know every step I take is measured. Do you think I'd risk my family for anyone, for some man I barely know?" She jabbed a finger toward his chest. "No, I wouldn't. Because you bought me like I was property. And I won't risk my father or my aunt for anyone, especially not someone who sees me as a prize to be owned." The office fell silent. The air between them crackled. Nora stood eye to eye with him, her shoulders squared, her breathing sharp and defiant. For a long, tense moment, Lucas stared at her, his lips pressed into a thin line, fury battling with disbelief. No one had dared speak to him like this in years. Finally, with a frustrated growl, he sank back into his chair, his glare never leaving her. Nora's chest heaved, but she didn't look away. Not this time. She had stood her ground, and he knew it. Lucas leaned back, steepling his fingers as if trying to recover his composure. "Careful, Nora," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Defiance has a cost." Nora's reply was sharp and steady. "So does cruelty." She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving Lucas fuming in silence. Lucas sat behind his desk, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming impatiently against the polished wood. The moment Chris entered, Lucas's eyes narrowed into slits. "Close. The door," Lucas ordered. His voice was low, dangerous. Chris obliged, shutting it with a quiet click before walking calmly to the center of the office. His demeanor was as steady as ever. Professional, unreadable, but there was a flicker of steel in his gaze. Lucas wasted no time. "Tell me, Atwater," he said, leaning forward, "are you trying to steal Nora from me?" Chris didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his cufflink, his tone measured. "You and I are not the same, Lucas. My dealings are different. My reputation depends on the company I keep. People expect me to treat my companion with respect." The words were calm, but they cut. Lucas's lip curled, his hands clenching into fists. "Respect?" he spat. "Is that what you call it? I call it weakness. She's meant to be reminded who owns her. Yet you—" He slammed his hand on the desk. "You look at her as if she matters." Chris tilted his head, his expression unchanging. "Sounds to me like you have some growing attachment to her." He paused deliberately, letting the words sink in. "Are you jealous, Lucas?" Lucas bristled, his face darkening with rage. "Watch your tongue." But Chris didn't stop. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but laced with challenge. "Do we need to end our contract sooner? If she's such a distraction for you, if her presence stirs something you can't control, perhaps it's best I release her back to you now." Lucas's eyes blazed. "Don't toy with me, Atwater. You know the terms." Chris allowed himself the faintest of smirks. "Yes, I do. And if we end this arrangement early, it will cost you. A great deal. Remember what you agreed to when you lent her to me. Are you willing to pay the price to have her back at your side? Full time?" His gaze sharpened, unblinking. "Is she really worth it?" For the first time in years, Lucas hesitated. His arrogance faltered just for a heartbeat. Jealousy gnawed at him, yes, but so did pride. To admit he wanted Nora for himself, to admit she had become more than a bargaining chip, would be weakness, and weakness was something Lucas Silverman never allowed himself. Chris saw it, and he pressed the silence like a knife. He straightened his suit jacket, his voice quiet but firm. "If you're so sure of your hold on her, then let her remain where she is. Unless, of course, you've begun to realize she's not as obedient as you think." Lucas's nostrils flared, but he leaned back in his chair, forcing composure. "Careful, Atwater. You're walking a fine line." Chris gave a short nod, his expression unreadable once more. "So are you." He turned and walked out, leaving Lucas simmering in his own fury, because for the first time he couldn't shake the thought that perhaps, just perhaps, he was losing control of Nora Wood. Chris Atwater had spent years studying Lucas Silverman, his habits, his temper, his weaknesses, and now, finally, he saw it clearly. For all Lucas's ruthlessness, for all his talk of ownership and control, he had a blind spot. That blind spot was Nora Wood. So Chris made his move. He invited her to another business dinner, but this time, his demeanor was different, less distant, less professional. His tone carried an ease that hadn't been there before. He leaned a little closer when he spoke, his eyes lingering longer than usual. Nora noticed immediately. Her spine stiffened, her pen stilling on the notepad. "What are you doing?" she demanded under her breath. Chris gave a sharp laugh, his smile cutting. "Making Lucas sweat," Nora's eyes flashed. "And making my life hell in the process," she retorted. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "One day," he said slowly, deliberately, "you will be mine, and Lucas won't be able to do a damn thing about it." Nora's breath caught and she tried to pull away, but Chris's hand tightened around her waist, holding her in place. "Let me go," she hissed, her voice sharp with discomfort, And then it happened. Just as Chris had suspected, Lucas Silverman appeared, his presence slicing through the air like a blade. His voice carried, sharp with menace. "Mr. Atwater, you seem to have a tight grip on her." Chris didn't flinch. He smiled coolly, his hand still on Nora's waist. "Yes, her waist is very soft." Nora's heart pounded in her chest. The room had gone silent. Too many eyes were watching. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking as she pleaded, "Please, let me go. Gentlemen, please don't do this in front of all these people." But Chris wasn't finished. He turned his head just enough for Lucas to hear, his tone mocking. "Don't worry, Miss Wood. We have a contract. You are mine, unless Mr. Silverman is ready to end it now." Lucas's fists curled at his sides, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "Mr. Atwater," he said, his voice low and edged with fury, "you are playing a dangerous game." Chris's smirk widened, unshaken. "Yes," he replied evenly. "Yes, I am." For a moment, the tension was unbearable. Nora trapped between the two men, Lucas seething, Chris unyielding, the watching crowd holding its collective breath. Lucas's pride and jealousy warred with his need to keep control, while Chris exuded the confidence of a man who had pushed his opponent exactly where he wanted him. Nora, her body rigid beneath Chris's hold, realized something chilling. She was no longer just a pawn in Lucas's game. She was becoming the center of Chris's strategy as well. And though his grip was not cruel like Lucas's, it was no less dangerous. Two predators circling each other, and she was the ground they fought to claim. Lucas Silverman was a man who prided himself on control, but rage had a way of unraveling even the most calculated predators. The morning after Chris's very public taunt, Lucas stormed into Chris' office, his fury boiling just beneath the surface. He summoned Chris Atwater without delay. Lucas didn't bother with pleasantries. His voice was venom. "You think you can humiliate me in front of her, in front of my associates? I should end you where you stand." Chris didn't flinch. He simply sat, calm as ever, and met Lucas's glare with cool indifference. "Go ahead," he said smoothly. "Prove to everyone you've lost control." The jab landed deep, and Lucas's pride snapped. He began pacing the office, his words tumbling out like a confession disguised as a boast. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Atwater. You think you can threaten me? I've made men disappear. People who crossed me. Gone. Never found. Families ruined, names erased, and no one could touch me." Chris tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "Is that so?" His tone was casual, baiting. Lucas smirked, mistaking Chris's composure for arrogance. "I've destroyed companies 10 times stronger than yours. I've gutted empires from the inside out. Do you want names?" He laughed darkly. "I could give you a list. Men who thought they were untouchable, CEOs, rivals, bankers, they're dust now." Chris leaned back in his chair, feigning disinterest. "And no one ever stopped you?" Lucas puffed out his chest, pride blazing in his eyes. "Because I have friends where it matters. Government officials, judges, regulators, you name it. They're all in my pocket, bought and paid for. They make sure no investigation gets too close, no reporter digs too deep. I've been unstoppable. For years." He leaned across the desk, glaring down at Chris, spittle on his lips from the force of his words. "And you? You're nothing more than a child trying to play a man's game. You don't scare me, Atwater. I've bled bigger sharks than you dry." Chris allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "You've been talking an awful lot, Lucas. Sure you want to keep going?" But Lucas, blinded by rage and ego, refused to stop. "You want details? Fine. I buried the Matheson family's firm in '08, paid to have their CFO vanish. I bought Senator Clarkson's loyalty in '15. He pushed through a bill that killed 3 investigations. The office door opened. Lucas froze mid-sentence. His words caught in his throat as half a dozen men and women in dark suits entered the room. Jackets parted to reveal badges clipped to their belts. FBI. Lucas Silverman, the lead agent said, his voice firm and commanding. "You're under arrest." Chris remained seated, his expression calm, almost satisfied, as agents swept in. Lucas turned to him, betrayal and disbelief twisting his face. You set me up?" Chris finally stood, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate precision. "No, Lucas," he said softly, though his eyes burned with triumph. "You set yourself up. All I did was let you talk." As the agents cuffed him and began reading his rights, Nora's face flashed through Lucas's mind. The one person he thought he owned had been the key to his undoing, and for the first time, Lucas Silverman realized he wasn't untouchable after all. When the news reached her, Nora could hardly breathe. Tatiana had rushed into the study, her phone buzzing with alerts. "They've arrested him," she said, her voice almost trembling with disbelief. "The FBI stormed his office. Lucas Silverman is finished." Nora sank into the chair, her body light-headed with a mixture of relief and shock. For months she had lived under the weight of his control, his threats, his games. To hear that he was in handcuffs, his empire crumbling, it felt unreal, like stepping into a dream she hadn't dared hope for. Her father, Charles, covered his face with his hands and whispered, "Thank God. Amelia, we're free." His shoulders shook as years of guilt and shame poured out in tears. Tatiana pulled him close, her eyes wet but fierce. Nora, though, couldn't rest easy. Relief coursed through her, but so did something else, questions. How had Chris managed it? Why had he involved her at all? And why did he seem so calm while Lucas tore himself apart? She didn't have to wait long. That evening, Chris asked to see her. They met in a quiet cafe tucked away from the buzz of the city. He was already seated when she arrived, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, as if he'd been waiting for this conversation for years. Nora slid into the booth across from him, her expression guarded. "You set him up," she said. "You baited him until he spilled everything." Chris nodded. "I did." "Why?" Her voice wavered between gratitude and anger. "Why involve me? Why let me suffer through his cruelty when you could have stopped him sooner?" Chris leaned back, his jaw tightening. For a moment he said nothing. Then his gaze softened, not with pity, but with something deeper, heavier. "Because this wasn't just about you, Nora. It was about him. Lucas Silverman destroyed my father's company years ago." Nora's breath caught. Chris's voice grew quieter, but the bitterness in it cut like steel. "My father built Atwater. Holdings from the ground up. It wasn't huge, but it was ours. Then Lucas came. Promises of partnerships, loans with hidden traps. The same game he played with your father. Only my father didn't survive it. The company collapsed. He lost everything he worked for, and within a year, he was gone." Chris's throat tightened, but he forced himself to continue. "I was young, but I remembered, and I swore one day I'd bring Lucas down." Nora stared at him, her heart twisting. Her heart. Suddenly, so much made sense. The distance, the calculation, the way he studied Lucas like prey. "So I was just another piece in your plan?" she asked bitterly. Chris shook his head firmly. "No, you were the one thing I didn't expect. When I first saw you with him, I thought you were another victim, but then I saw the fire in your eyes. You weren't broken even when he tried to make you his. That's when I knew. You weren't just leverage. You were the key. You gave me what I couldn't get close enough to take myself." Nora's hands tightened around her cup, her emotions warring. "You used me," she whispered. "I did," Chris admitted without hesitation. Then he leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "But I also protected you. Every time he pushed too far, every time he tried to humiliate you, I made sure he didn't cross a line he couldn't return from. If I hadn't been there, Nora, he would have broken you. Or worse." Silence stretched between them, heavy. and raw. Finally, Nora exhaled shakily. "So what now?" Chris's gaze softened. "Now," he said, his voice steady, "you're free of him, and I've kept my promise to my father. But you and that's a different question altogether." For the first time, Nora saw the man behind the calculation, not just the strategist, not just her reluctant ally, but someone scarred, driven, and human. And she wasn't sure if that terrified her more than Lucas ever had. In the months that followed Lucas Silverman's arrest, life moved in two very different directions. Chris Atwater became a name whispered in legal circles, his cooperation with federal agents turning years of evidence into a case that crippled half of Lucas's network. He was busy, always flying between cities, buried in testimony and closed-door meetings. If he thought of Nora Wood, and she often wondered if he did, he never reached out. Nora, meanwhile, poured herself into rebuilding her father's company. With Charles's health fragile and his confidence still bruised, she stepped forward, determined to prove herself as the leader she had always known she could be. She negotiated contracts, repaired old relationships, and rebranded the company into something strong, transparent, and modern. She worked with Tatiana at her side, and though the shadows of Lucas's hold sometimes haunted her dreams, her days were filled with purpose. Still, sometimes in the quiet moments, late at night in the office, or walking home through the city, she thought of Chris, his sharp laugh, his steady presence, the way his eyes softened just slightly when no one else was watching. He had used her, yes, but he had also shielded her, and those contradictions clung to her heart. Then, almost exactly, a year later she saw them, a dozen white roses waiting on her office desk. Tucked inside was a small card, the handwriting clean and bold. "Will you have dinner with me? Atwater." Her heart gave a startled leap. She read the note 3 times before whispering to herself, "He remembered." The next evening, Nora arrived. At a local family-owned restaurant, the kind of cozy place with red-checkered tablecloths and the smell of garlic bread clinging to the air. Chris was already waiting at a corner table. He looked different, older, sharper, but better. His suit was tailored, his hair shorter. But when he smiled at her, all of Nora's walls trembled. Her heart melted, just as it had the first time. She caught a glimpse of the man behind the strategist. "Nora," he said warmly, standing to pull out her chair. "Thank you for coming." The evening passed easily, almost unexpectedly so. They spoke about everything except Lucas Silverman and the investigation. He asked about her company, listened attentively as she shared her plans and victories. She asked about his travels, and he told her stories of late-night flights, small triumphs, and even a few self-deprecating tales that made her laugh. For once, the shadows that had defined their connection didn't hover over them. By the time dessert was cleared away, Nora realized she hadn't felt so light in years. When Chris walked her to her car, he paused, his hands tucked in his pockets. For a moment, he seemed almost unsure, a rare sight in a man who was usually so composed. "I had a good time tonight," he said softly. "So did I," Nora admitted. He hesitated, then asked, "Would you let me take you out again?" Nora's lips curved into a slow smile. "Are you asking me out, Mr. Atwater?" His grin widened, boyish in a way she'd never seen before. Yes, I am." Her heart fluttered, warmth spreading through her chest. "Then yes, I'll go." They began to see each other slowly. Coffee on Sunday mornings, walks in the park, dinners at quiet restaurants where no one knew their names. With each meeting, the distance that had once separated them faded. What began as cautious steps grew into something undeniable, something tender and real. And for the first time in years, Nora allowed herself to believe in a future not defined by fear or survival, but by choice, by love. Over the months, Nora saw a side of Chris Atwater that few others ever glimpsed. He was still sharp and disciplined in his work, but with her he was softer. He remembered the little things, her favorite tea, the way she hummed absent-mindedly when she was focused, the fact that she always kept a notebook nearby for sudden ideas. When he called, it wasn't to demand her presence or extract information. It was to ask if she had eaten, to say goodnight, or to simply tell her he was thinking of her. And that, more than the roses, more than the dinners, proved to Nora that Chris was nothing like Lucas Silverman. Lucas had thrived on control, bending her life into something that fed his ego. Chris, by contrast, gave her space to breathe, to grow. He didn't need to own her. He wanted to walk beside her. One evening, nearly a year into their careful courtship, Chris invited Nora to his apartment. She'd never been there before, and stepping into his world was strangely intimate. His space was tidy, almost Spartan, save for the bookshelves stacked with old law journals, case studies, and a few framed photos. On the mantel sat a single picture of a man Nora guessed was his father. Strong jaw, steady eyes. They cooked dinner together, pasta and salad, and ended up on the couch sipping wine as the city lights twinkled through the window. For a while, they talked about ordinary things. Her father's slow recovery, Tatiana's new garden, the company's steady growth. But eventually, the conversation shifted. Chris set his glass down, his eyes lingering on the photo of his father. "I've spent most of my life chasing one man," he admitted quietly. "Lucas Silverman destroyed everything my father built. He destroyed him. And I thought if I could bring Lucas down, it would heal something inside me." Nora leaned closer, listening, her heart tightening at the vulnerability in his voice. "I was wrong," Chris continued. "When Lucas was arrested, when I finally saw him dragged out of his empire in cuffs, I thought I'd feel peace. But all I felt was empty. Because revenge doesn't heal. It just consumes you." He turned to her, his eyes steady. "It wasn't until I met you that I realized what I was missing wasn't justice. It was love. I've never been in love before, Nora. Not truly. But with you, I am." Nora's breath caught, her chest swelling with emotion. She had suspected he cared, but to hear him say it, raw and unguarded, stirred something deep within her. Chris reached for her hand, his touch gentle, unhurried. "You are not a commodity. You are not leverage. You are the most remarkable woman I've ever known. I don't want a future built on revenge anymore. I want one built with you." Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Chris." He squeezed her hand, his voice trembling now, though his resolve was clear. "I'm asking for a future together. Not for tonight, not for tomorrow, but long-term. Marriage, family, whatever you dream of, I want it with you. I can't promise. Life will always be simple, but I can promise. This, I will never treat you the way he did. I will never try to own you. I just want to love you, Nora." Nora's tears slipped free, but her smile shone through them. For so long she had been treated as a pawn, a bargaining chip, a possession. To hear Chris speak those words, to see him break through years of armor, to bare his heart to her, was more than she had ever hoped for. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "You've given me something Lucas never could. Choice. And I choose you, Chris." For the first time in his life, Chris Atwater felt the weight of revenge lift from his shoulders. In its place was something far more powerful: hope. The weeks after Chris's confession felt different, lighter. Nora felt her heart open in ways she never thought possible after everything she had endured. Chris didn't press or rush her. Instead, he wove himself into her life gently, proving day after day that his words weren't just a moment of passion, they were his truth. He was there when she closed her first major contract on behalf of her father's company, waiting outside her office with champagne and the proudest smile she had ever seen. He was there on quiet Sundays, helping Tatiana plant roses in the garden, listening to Charles tell long stories from years ago, never making it seem like he was too important or too busy for them. He wasn't Lucas. He wasn't there to dominate her world. He was there to share it. And slowly, Nora began to realize she couldn't imagine a life without him. One evening, Chris asked her to dinner. "Not business, not casual," he said with a mysterious smile. "Just special." Nora arrived at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in dusky pink and gold. Soft lights twinkled across the terrace, candles flickered on each table, and a small quartet played quietly in the corner. The entire rooftop was empty, save for one beautifully set table. Her heart fluttered when she saw him. Chris stood waiting, dressed in a tailored navy suit, his hair swept neatly back. But it wasn't his suit or the setting that stole her breath. It was the warmth in his eyes, the kind of look that stripped away every wall she'd ever built. "You look," Chris started, then laughed softly, shaking his head. "I don't even have the words." Dinner was perfect, simple, delicious, filled with laughter and tender silences. They reminisced about the first time they met, about the long months of confusion and conflict, about the strength it had taken for Nora to endure Lucas and for Chris to stay patient with his revenge. But they didn't dwell on the pain. Tonight was about what they had become. When dessert was cleared away, Chris grew quiet. He stood, coming around to her side of the table, and extended his hand. "Dance with me?" Nora smiled, slipping her hand into his. The quartet shifted seamlessly, into a slow, lilting melody. He led her to the center of the terrace, drawing her close, not possessively, not with dominance, but with reverence. His hand rested lightly at her waist, his other hand cradling hers. For a few moments they simply moved together, the city glittering around them. Nora felt safe, cherished. She knew, deep down, that this was where she was meant to be. Then Chris's heartbeat quickened beneath her cheek. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his expression suddenly earnest. "Nora," he said, softly, his voice almost breaking, "I've spent years chasing shadows. I lived for revenge, for the day Lucas Silverman would pay for what he did to my family. But the truth is, the day he went down wasn't the day I got my life back. It was the day I met you." Tears stung Nora's eyes. Chris dropped to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. The candles flickered, the music swelled, and the world seemed to stop. "I never thought I'd know what love was," he continued, his voice unsteady with emotion. "I never thought I'd want anything beyond justice. But you've changed me, Nora. You've given me more than hope. You've given me a future I never dreamed possible. I don't want to spend another day without you by my side." He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant diamond ring that caught the light and shimmered. "Nora Wood," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "Will you marry me?" For a moment, Nora couldn't breathe. Every memory rushed through her. The nights of fear, the chains of humiliation, the battle to reclaim her life. And standing here, with Chris Atwater offering not control but choice, not ownership but partnership, her heart knew the answer. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. Then louder, through tears and laughter. "Yes, Chris, 1,000 times. Yes." Chris's relief and joy broke through in a wide, unguarded smile. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose, sweeping her into his arms as the musicians swelled into a triumphant refrain. For the first time, Nora wasn't someone's pawn, someone's leverage, or someone's possession. She was a woman who had endured, who had fought, who had found love in the most unexpected place. And as Chris held her close, whispering against her hair, "You're my forever," Nora knew this was the future she had been fighting for all along the end. Hope you enjoyed this story by Green Tea Tales. Please support our channel with comments, likes and subscribe. Thank you.